here at the University of Calgary, and the first one to use dogs in the human performance lab that I'm aware of. So we'll have to change the name pretty soon, I guess. So I'm motivated by the question of why normal is normal. And human gait is highly stereotyped, especially when you consider the alternative patterns of motion that we could use, but generally choose not to. So why are normal gaits normal at all? And the hypothesis that we go from is that normal is some minimum on some metabolic cost surface. The surface is obviously highly multidimensional, depends on your step frequency, step length, your instantaneous forces, and all that sort of thing. But we can test this hypothesis by constraining people to do unusual things and see what they do and how their cost changes. And one thing that is somewhat unusual is the flat walk or the Grotra walk, which is an extremely compliant gait, especially as compared to the pendular walk. And if you try to perform a flat walk, you'll find that it does indeed seem to be a really good workout. But there are circumstances where we do actually naturally increase our compliance when we walk. So you guys can try this at home or in the hallways here, but if you start taking long steps, you'll notice that you bend your legs a lot more. So I'll know who's seen my talk by who's walking funny. But if we use simple point mass models, like sort of by Sandra and Karina in their 2006 Nature paper, you can find that indeed there are conditions at long step lengths and intermediate speeds where a flat walk is actually energetically better than a pendular walk or an impulsive run. And a undergraduate student, Jay Kim, along with John Bertram, my supervisor, actually got people in the lab and made them do a flat walk and a pendular walk over constrained step length, and do find that indeed the flat walk seems to outperform the pendular walk at large step lengths. But a criticism of this approach and many others is that you're constraining someone to do something that is quite unnatural. There's not very many circumstances in the natural world where we have to take particular step lengths for a long period of time. So are we over constraining this, and is there any ecological relevance at all? Well, we also have other animals apart from humans in the world, and they have a unique constraint. And so many mammals have this feature where the hind limb is quite a lot longer than the forelimb. And what I want to suggest today is this provides a natural constraint on step length. So if the animal is moving at a steady gait, then the forelimbs on average have to move at the same speed as the hind limbs, otherwise you're starting to increase your torso length or compress it. And you have to take the same average step length. And so in absolute terms, these things are doing the exact same thing, but if we normalize to the step length, then indeed the forelimbs are taking a relatively longer step than the hind limbs are and are moving relatively faster. And now if we think about what this means in the space of step length versus horizontal speed, of course normalized to your leg length, then there's regions where a pendular walk is optimal, a run is optimal, and indeed where a flat walk is optimal. And for a dog, a typical step length speed relationship looks something like this, but it's different for the forelimbs compared to the hind limbs. We shift the line up a little bit, and we also shift forward in terms of speed. So if the hind limbs are moving here, well, then they might be in a position where a flat walk is optimal, but the forelimbs are in a position where a run is optimal. So this begs the question, are there actually certain speeds where the hind limbs and the forelimbs need to use very different gaits to achieve some sort of energetic optimality? That's kind of my big question. Of course, this is making a lot of hand-wavy assumptions, like that there's not that much dynamic interaction between the forelimbs and the hind limbs. So we can do a little bit better by using a very simple model of the organism. We just take a handful of morphological parameters from the literature, including forelimbs, maximal length and hind limb length in standing. And then we plug this into an optimization model where we give it a particular average horizontal speed and stride length, say achieve a steady gait while satisfying physics, and then it just does everything else. So it comes up with the limb forces and extension, body pitch, step fall timing, etc., etc. And what we're optimizing here is a summation of absolute leg work plus a force rate penalty. And if you want to know more about this particular model, we have a bioarchive paper on it. The model actually works quite well. It predicts that you should have this 4-beat walk at slow speeds and transition to a trot at intermediate speeds, among other things. But one of the interesting predictions is that the compliance or the change in leg length during stance should be higher for the forelimbs as compared to the hind limbs. It should be more sensitive to speed in walking, and then it should flatten out for trotting. So we decided to actually try to test this. So we got our volunteer, Sponge, and we put him in this onesie. He thought that wasn't a great fashion choice, but he was okay with it because we fed him lots of treats and peanut butter. And then we have these active markers that we can track in this motion capture space with a instrumented treadmill. And so this is the whole thing in operation. And after a few days of training, the dog gets quite comfortable, set up, and is able to do what we want it to do. And what we wanted to do is to probe the space. So we have 1-minute steady trials at a whole range of speeds. We try to randomize the order to avoid sequencing effects. And here are the results in terms of compliance. So you can see that indeed the change in leg length during stance is much larger in the forelimbs as compared to the hind limbs. And that is what we predict in the model, and the sort of overall magnitude is about the same as well. And it also does seem like for slow speeds, there's a much sharper change in compliance with speed than at higher speeds. But that transition does not occur where we think it does. And by the way, this solid line is about where, or this dotted black line is about where the walk-trot transition happens. So some things are predicted well by the model, some things aren't, but overall it does seem like a change in relative step length has resulted in a change in compliance. The model also makes other predictions, which include how the shape of the ground reaction forces should change with the legs. And so the blue is slow speed, red is higher speed, and as we increase speed, we sort of lose this dip, which means we've stopped vaulting and we've shifted to a more running gait with a single peak. But this change happens differently in the forelimbs versus the hind limbs, which means that there's sort of some awkward intermediate speed where we should see a single peak in the forelimbs and a double peak in the hind limbs, suggesting that the hind limbs are walking while the forelimbs are running in a way. And so far we haven't been able to analyze the ground reaction forces, but there is evidence in horses that this does actually occur. And this study on tolting in Icelandic horses shows that at a very slow tolt, you'll get the forelimbs doing sort of a run and the hind limbs having this double peak indicating walk. So we can kind of approximate quadrupeds as two bipeds. I wouldn't go too far with this idea, but it does make some interesting predictions. So the front legs should take relatively longer steps than the back, which means that they should have higher compliance in the front legs versus the back legs, and that doesn't indeed seem to be borne out. And it also predicts that there should be speeds where different gaits are used by the hind versus the forelimbs optimally, and this is not something that we've fully tested yet, but we're planning to. And so if this holds up, then the question is, does each pair of limbs have its own controller in a way? Is the motor control system sending a gross signal up to both limbs, or does each limb have its own sort of response to its local conditions? I don't know the answer to that, but I'd be very interested in chatting with you about it. Thank you very much for your time.
Questions? Yeah.
So, in the model, the lines went up and leveled at that level, and in the animal, the lines went up and then shifted to a lower level.
Yeah.
For the flat part. What's going on there?
No idea. We just collected this data last week, so haven't had a lot of time. But that's a good observation, and I don't know the answer.
Chase Rock, Georgia Tech. It would be interesting to test your last question there, whether it's two controllers or one controller. If you connected to humans with an artificial trunk, because they each have different controllers, and you can match height or not, and then see if they adopt the same strategies.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that some people are pursuing, including James Croft, who's here in the front. So yeah, that's a great question, and so far I haven't seen, the jury's still out on that, but yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I had a similar thought. If you made people stand on pole, like on their hands and the legs are way longer than the hands, and we use our hands separately from that what
Yeah.
the legs was.
Okay, so I challenge you to come to the HPL and try to walk on forelimbs on the treadmill. It's really hard. I did this before we could bring the dogs in just to see if things are working, and yeah, you can't go very fast until you start
Horse girl.
falling off, and it's very beautiful. Yeah.
Josh Gross, Michigan State. Do you think that, so practically, do you think animals would ever move at speeds where they'd be in two different gait patterns, or would they just choose a slower or faster speed
Yeah, that's
if not constrained?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is that typically they will choose a lower or faster speed. Those parts where there should be a difference in the forelimbs and hindlimbs tends to be right around that walk-trot transition, which is very energetically expensive because most people here have read Hoyt Taylor and various other people where you have those bowl shapes in the cost of transport for different gaits. So at the transition, you're at a relatively high cost of transport. So though animals probably don't want to stay in that transitional zone because it's very expensive. And so even if there's a constraint on average speed, say, oh, I want to get from here to there in 2 minutes, it's much better to use a run-walk mixture where you're moving at the optimal speed for both, and overall you can match the average speed. So I think that, I make this claim that, oh, this is ecologically more relevant, but maybe it actually, there's very few circumstances where this actually occurs in reality.
Okay, let's thank Delisle again.